She mocked him for buying 20 rusted wrecks for $3,000. 45 days later, she tried to buy them back 20 cars. That was what the auction manifest said. 20 vehicles, lot 47C through 47V, sold as a single unit, no separation, no reserve, current condition as. The manifest listed them the way municipal surplus auctions always list things. Without sentiment, without history, without the particular kind of attention that would have told anyone paying close attention that what was sitting in rows 3 and 4 of the Harwick County impound yard was not, in fact, 20 rusted wrecks. It was a 1967 Mustang Fastback with a cracked windshield and original Wimbledon, white paint buried under 40 years of surface rust. A 1969 Camaro Z28 with a seized engine and both doors still present and straight. A 1971 Chevelle SS, hood missing, rear quarter caved, numbers matching badge still riveted to the firewall. And 17 others, each one a different kind of patience test. Each one asking the same question that old cars always ask of the people who look at them. Do you see what I was, or only what I am? The man who had looked, who had spent 3 Saturdays in a row driving to the Harwick impound yard with a flashlight and a magnet and a notebook, crouching in the mud between rows, while his 6-year-old daughter Maisie sat on the hood of his truck eating crackers from a Ziploc bag with a stuffed bear named Cub tucked under her arm, was Caleb Morrow. He was 32 years old. He drove a 2004 pickup with 214,000 miles on it. His hands, when he stood to his full height at the auction registration desk on a Tuesday morning in April, looked like hands that had been used for their intended purpose for a long time. He paid $3,000. The lot closed in 11 seconds. Nobody else bid. Standing 20 feet away, next to a man in a blazer who was logging lots on a tablet, was a woman who laughed when the gavel came down. She said, loud enough that the row of buyers behind her heard it clearly. Someone just paid $3,000 for $3,000 worth of scrap. Her name was Vanessa Cahill. She owned Cahill Salvage and Auto Brokerage, the largest used car operation in the county. She had been buying Harwick auction lots for 9 years. She had driven past those 20 cars without stopping, because she had decided, from the lane, that they weren't worth her time. She was wrong. She would spend the next 45 days finding out exactly how wrong. Don't go anywhere. This one pays out. The Tuesday that Caleb Morrow paid $3,000 for 20 cars was the same Tuesday that Maisie Morrow turned 6 years old, which was a fact that had required some negotiation in the preceding weeks because Maisie had been very clear about wanting to spend her birthday doing something involving either a pool or a trampoline, and Caleb had been very clear that the Harwick auction was only twice a year, and that he had a feeling about Lot 47C through 47VE that he could not fully explain but which he trusted, because he had learned, slowly and over the course of many years, that feelings of that particular quality were not nothing. They had reached an agreement. Auction in the morning, trampoline park in the afternoon, dinner at the place with the good garlic bread that Maisie had specified by name, and that Caleb had noted in the small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, where he also kept measurements, VIN numbers, lot references, and the occasional drawing of an engine component that he needed to hold in his head. At the trampoline park, Maisie had jumped for 2 hours, with Cub watching from a cubby they had designated as the bear's observation post. Because Cub did not jump, this had been established. But Cub was a very good observer and took the role seriously. At the garlic bread place, Maisie had said, "Dad, do you think the cars are sad?" Caleb had said, "I think they've been waiting." Maisie had said, "Waiting for what?" He had said, "For someone who could see what they were." She had thought about this while eating. Then she said, "Like Cub." He had said, "Exactly like Cub." Maisie had found Cub at a garage sale when she was 3, on a table of items priced at 50 cents each. in a condition that suggested previous ownership by a child who had loved him with the specific intensity that small children bring to things. Caleb had paid 50 cents for a bear that Maisie had since refused to sleep without, travel without, or, on one memorable occasion, have a vaccination appointment without. The nurse having been very understanding about accommodating a bear at the relevant moment. He had not told her that he'd almost walked past that table, that he'd only stopped because something about the way the bear was sitting had caught his eye. He had learned to trust that kind of catching. The tow truck made 4 trips. Caleb drove support each time in the pickup, following the flatbed back to the property at 8 Garner Road, a 3-acre parcel outside town with a metal roof workshop that had belonged to Caleb, father, and before that to Caleb's grandfather, a man named Roy Morrow, who had, by all available accounts, been able to make any engine on Earth run with whatever he happened to have nearby. Roy had died before Caleb was born. But the workshop remained, and the tools in it, and the particular smell of it, oil and metal, and something that might have been time. And the walls lined with pegboard on, which hung tools in the shapes they had been arranged in decades, before Caleb first reached up to touch them as a child. By the end of the 4th tow truck run, all 20 cars were on the property. Caleb walked the row in the late afternoon light, notebook open, flashlight in the other hand, even though it wasn't dark yet. Because a flashlight at an angle tells you things about metal that daylight straight down does not. He measured. He photographed. He checked the firewall tags on each car that had them. He crouched in the dirt under the Chevelle and looked at the frame rails with the careful attention of someone reading a language he had learned. Very young, not junk, not one of them. The Mustang's rust was surface only. The floors were solid, which he had suspected from the panel gaps. The Camaro's engine had seized from sitting, not from failure. There was no scoring on the block, which he had checked with a bore scope at the impound yard on his second Saturday visit. The Chevelle's rear quarter would need replacement, but the quarter was a production part available from 3 suppliers he already had accounts with. What Vanessa Cahill had seen from a lane, in passing with no flashlight, was Rex. What Caleb Morrow saw was 20 projects, each one solvable, each one waiting. He made a list. He assigned an order, not by value but by mechanical complexity, starting with the cars that needed the most time, so the most time could be given to them. He noted which parts could be shared across platforms. He calculated hours. Then he went inside, made dinner, and told Maisie about the Chevelle, which she listened to with genuine interest, because she had been listening to descriptions of old cars since before she could form complete sentences, and had developed, in consequence, a detailed working knowledge of mid-century American automotive design that her kindergarten teacher had found startling. Word traveled the way it travels in small counties. Not fast and not slow, but thoroughly. By the end of the first week, the story of the man who had paid $3,000 for 20 impound cars had made a complete circuit of the local automotive and collector community. The responses ranged from skeptical to entertained. 2 men who dealt in classic cars, brothers named Grady and Pete Sills, who operated out of a barn on Route 9 and who had seen most things in 40 years of buying and selling, had driven past the Garner Road property slowly on a Thursday afternoon, slowed down at the gate, and kept going without stopping. Grady Sills called Caleb the following Monday. He said, "Those are real cars." Caleb said, "Yes." Grady said, "What are you planning?" Caleb said, "Restore them." There was a pause. Grady said, "All 20." Caleb said, "All 20." Another pause. Grady said, "In what time frame?" Caleb said, "The first 6 by end of summer, the rest by spring." He heard Grady say something away from the phone, presumably to Pete. Then Grady said, "What do you need?" He did not need much, it turned out. What he needed was already mostly in the workshop, or available from suppliers he trusted. What he needed most was time, and that was the thing he organized his entire life around. Not in the way people use that phrase loosely, but in the specific and logistical sense that every hour from 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. was dedicated to the workshop, that Maisie's school schedule and her meal times and her bedtime routine were the fixed points around which everything else arranged itself, that there was a schedule on the kitchen wall with color-coded blocks that Maisie had helped design, and which she monitored with a seriousness that Caleb found both moving and practically useful. Maisie came to the workshop on Saturdays. She had her own stool at the workbench, a tall one that Caleb had cut down and re-legged to her height when she was 4, and which had since had its seat repainted twice at Maisie's request. Currently a particular shade of blue that she had selected from a hardware store sample card, and about which she had been very decided. Cub sat on the workbench near her when she was doing something, and on her lap when she wasn't. And sometimes, when Caleb was under a car on the creeper, Maisie would talk to him from above about what she could see, describing the undercarriage in terms she had absorbed from years of proximity to people who talked about cars the way other families talked about their days. She said things like, "The rust on the bottom is orange, not brown. Is that better?" And Caleb would say, "Orange is surface. Brown means it went deeper." And she would look more carefully and say, "It's orange, definitely orange." And he would say, "Good eye." By the end of week 3, the Mustang was stripped to bare metal. By the end of week 4, it was in primer. The color, the original Wimbledon white, which Caleb had matched from a paint code he'd found stamped on the door jamb under 3 layers of subsequent owners' choices, went on in week 5. He did the bodywork himself, the way Roy Morrow had done bodywork, the way Caleb's father had taught him, when Caleb was 9 years old, standing in this same workshop, watching the same kind of patience applied to a different car. The Camaro engine broke free on a Sunday afternoon in week 4 with a sound that Maisie, sitting on her blue-seated stool, described accurately as, like when something decides to stop being stuck. He looked up at her from the engine bay. He said, "That's exactly right." She wrote it in her own notebook, which was pink, and had Cub's name on the cover in marker, and which contained a mixture of drawings, vocabulary words, and what appeared to be developing automotive notes in the handwriting of a 6-year-old. Vanessa Cahill heard about the Mustang from a man named Douglas Chen, who ran the county's only dedicated classic car insurer, and who had received a call from Caleb in week 5 to begin the process of getting coverage in place before the car moved. Douglas had seen the paint. Douglas had, in 30 years of valuing restored American muscle, a precise and unsentimental sense of what things were worth. He had called Vanessa because they had done business for years, and because he thought she would want to know what was happening on Garner Road. She drove out on a Wednesday. She pulled up at the gate on the road, and she could see, even from the road, the Mustang sitting in the morning light outside the workshop. Fresh paint, new glass, period-correct details. She sat in her car for a moment. She had said 23 days ago that someone had paid $3,000 for $3,000 worth of scrap. She took out her phone. She had Caleb's number from county auction records. She called. He picked up on the 3rd ring. She could hear shop noise behind him. She said, "This is Vanessa Cahill. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." Caleb said, "We didn't get off on any kind of foot. You made a comment at an auction." "I didn't respond," she said. "I'd like to come and talk about the cars," he said. "You're welcome to come in." She came in on the Thursday. Caleb showed her the Mustang first, because the Mustang was the most finished, and because he was not a person who concealed the quality of his work. She walked around it 3 times. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "What do you want for it?" He said, "It's not for sale yet." She said, "Everything is for sale at a price," he said. "I'll let you know when I'm ready." She looked at the other cars. The Camaro, mid-engine rebuild. The Chevelle with its rear quarter blocked out for the new panel. The others in various stages of strip and preparation. She was quiet in the way that people who deal in valuable things get quiet when they are. Making calculations, she said, "I have a buyer for the Mustang, and I think I have buyers for at least 4 others." Caleb said, "I appreciate that." She said, "I could move these faster than you can sell them independently." He said, "I know," she said, "so why wouldn't you want that?" He said, "Because faster isn't what I'm optimizing for." She looked at him. She said, "Then what are you optimizing for?" He thought about how to answer this in a way she would understand. He said, "I need the cars to be right. If they're right, the buyers will come. They always come for right." She left without a deal. But she came back. She came back on day 31. The Camaro was running. She heard it from the road. Heard the particular sound of an engine that has been brought back from a seizure correctly, which is a sound that has a quality of relief in it that Caleb had never been able to explain, but which he recognized immediately, and which still, after all the years of doing this work, made something move in him that he had given up trying to name. She came through the gate this time. She walked to the workshop. She looked at the Camaro. She said, "I underestimated you." He was wiping down the engine bay. He did not stop wiping. He said, "I noticed." She said, "I want to make a deal. I want to represent the sale of all 20 cars if you'll let me. I have the network. I have buyers in 4 states." She said, "What I don't have is inventory like this." Caleb set down the shop rag. He looked at her. He said, "You laughed." She said, "I know." He said, "You laughed loud enough that people turned around." She said, "I know." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What do you think they're worth?" She named a number. Not the wrong kind of number. The right kind. The kind that comes from someone who has stopped trying to get an advantage and started trying to do accurate arithmetic. The Mustang alone, she said, would bring $42,000 to $48,000 in the current market from the right buyer. The Camaro, given the numbers matching status and the engine quality, 55 to 60. The Chevelle finished with the correct panel and the correct paint. She paused. She said, "The Chevelle is the one that surprises people." Caleb said, "The Chevelle is always the one that surprises people." He had known that from the auction. He had known it when he crouched in the mud with a flashlight and found the badge still on the firewall. He said, "I'll give you 6 of them." The first 6 finished, non-exclusive. "If the first 6 go right, we talk about the rest," she said. "What counts as going right?" He said. "The buyers know what they're getting. They're not oversold, and they're happy 6 months later." She said, "That's a high bar." He said, "That's the only bar." She nodded. She said, "When will the first 6 be ready?" He said, 45 days from the auction, give or take a week." She did the math. She said, "That's now." He said, "Close." He said, "Come back Saturday." Saturday was the first day of May. Maisie did not have school. She came to the workshop at 8 in the morning, with Cub under her arm and a cereal bar in her hand, and the particular energy of a person who knows something significant is happening and is prepared to be present for it. Grady and Pete Sills arrived at 9 Mi. Douglas Chen arrived at 9:30. A man named Adrian Walsh, who bought and sold collector cars at a level that Grady Sills described, with respect, as a different atmosphere entirely. He had driven 3 hours, a trip he had made based on a single phone call from Douglas, whose judgment he trusted without reservation, arrived at 9:45. 6 cars were outside the workshop in the morning light. The Mustang, the Camaro, the Chevelle, its rear quarter replaced and painted and correct, looking exactly as it had looked when it left the Norwood, Ohio assembly plant in 1971. A 1970 Plymouth Cuda with its shaker hood intact and its engine rebuilt to the specification, Caleb had verified against the broadcast sheet he'd found tucked behind the rear seat on inventory night. a 1968 Firebird 400, blue, that had arrived at the impound yard 15 years ago, under circumstances lost to municipal record, and that had sat there since, waiting. And a 1969 Dodge Charger RT that Caleb had saved for last among the first six, not because it was the most valuable. It was, by some calculations, the most valuable. But because it had needed the most care, and he had wanted to give it the time it needed. Vanessa Cahill arrived at 10. She stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the row. She looked for a longer moment than she had intended to. Then she walked in. Adrian Walsh moved slowly down the row of cars with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of a man who has spent his life learning not to react visibly to things and is currently being tested. He stopped at the Charger for a long time. He crouched to look at the door sill. He stood. He looked at Caleb. He said, "Did you see these?" Caleb said. "Harwick County impound. Municipal surplus auction. 20-car lot." Adrian said, "What did you pay?" Caleb said, $3,000. Adrian Walsh was quiet for a moment. He said, "For all 20. Caleb said, "Yes." Adrian looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at the ground. Grady Sills said, not unkindly, "She was there." Vanessa said, "I was at the auction. I didn't bid." Adrian looked at her for a moment. Not harshly. He said, "Why not?" She said, "I drove past the road too fast." He said, "That's an expensive drive." She said nothing. It was the appropriate response. The Mustang sold before noon. The Camaro sold an hour later to a man Adrian called, who drove over from the neighboring county and arrived, still in the jacket he'd put on over whatever he'd been wearing when the call came in, looked at the car for 20 minutes, and wrote a check. The Charger went to Adrian himself, which Caleb had half expected, because the Charger was the kind of car that finds its person quickly when the person is there to be found. By 4 in the afternoon, 5 of the 6 had sold. The Firebird was spoken for, pending a bank transfer that Douglas Chen confirmed by 4:30. Vanessa sat on a wooden chair outside the workshop during the last sale. She had her notebook out. She had been doing her job. She had made calls. She had provided context to buyers. She had been useful and professional throughout. But she was quieter than when she had arrived. Caleb brought her a cup of coffee. He set it down beside her. He said nothing. She said, "What do you want for the right to represent the remaining 14? He said, "What we agreed. Non-exclusive, per car terms," she said. "I mean," he paused, she said, "I was rude to you at the auction." He said, "You were loud," she said. "I want to do right by this, by the work." He looked at her. He said, "Then do right by it," he said. "The buyers matter more than the margin. If you hold that, we'll be fine," she said. "You built all of this in 45 days, he said. "I had the nights," he said, "and I had help." He looked toward the workshop, where Maisie was sitting on her blue-seated stool at the workbench, Cub in her lap, drawing something in the pink notebook. She had spent most of the day watching the transactions with a researcher's attention, and she had asked, during a quiet moment in the early afternoon, whether all the people who bought the cars knew that the cars had been waiting. Caleb had said, not in those words, "But they know the cars are right." That's the same thing. She had nodded and written something in her notebook. Nora, Maisie, came to find him at 5:30, when the last buyer's car had pulled out of the gate and the property was quiet again. She came with Cub under her arm and the pink notebook tucked against her chest, and she stood in the space where the 6 cars had been, and she looked at the empty ground. She said, "They all found their people." Caleb said, "They did." She said, "What about the other 14? He said, "They're waiting. They'll find theirs." She looked at the workshop, at the remaining cars visible through the open doors, at the light inside. That was the same light that had been in this workshop for decades, the same quality of it, the same angle in the late afternoon. She held Cub a little tighter. She said, "Dad, did Grandpa Roy work on cars like these?" Caleb said, "Cars like these and others." She said, "Did he know they were good?" He said, He's always new. She said, how? He said, he looked at them the way you look at Cub. Not at what they were, at what they could be. Maisie looked at Cub. She held him at arm's length the way she sometimes did when she was examining something she wanted to understand. Then she held him back against her chest. She said, I think the cars are glad. He said, I think so too. She went inside to set the table. He stood in the open workshop door for a moment, looking at the 14 cars in their rows. The light was going the particular way it goes in early May. Slowly, without an announcement, as if it has decided not to make a thing of leaving. He had 14 more projects. He had the nights. He had the notebook in his jacket pocket. He had a 6-year-old daughter who could identify surface rust by color, and who kept automotive notes in a pink notebook, and who had asked the right question about Lot 47C through 47V before anyone else had thought to ask it. He turned off the overhead light. He left the small bench light on, the way he always did, so that when he came back after Maisie was asleep, the workshop would not be entirely dark. So it would look, from the road, as though someone was in there working, because someone would be. He went inside to make dinner.